There's a stigma. There's a stigma towards people who live with their parents. Wouldn't you say? We talked about this on
Probably
air.
written by some guy who lives in his parents' basement. You've heard that.
Right. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, went to the phones, and people offered really varied and interesting perspectives on adult children that live with them.
Right. And our question had to do with, if you have adult children, what are your financial parameters with them?
Right.
But our conversations with listeners went in a completely different direction. And we had several people calling to not talk about that as much as how they didn't want to be living with their parents, had to for different reasons. And then they were so glad that they were.
Yeah. It opened our eyes, quite honestly, changed the perspective. Well, Karen Swallow Pryor is with us. Karen's been a regular guest on our show throughout the years. She is research professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, the author of multiple books. I'm sure we'll talk about that during the conversation. But she wrote a piece that was picked up by a religion news service, Living with Your Parents Intentionally Can Be Life-Giving. Karen, friend, how are you?
I'm good. It's good to be back with you guys. It's been a while.
Yes.
It sure has. Karen, before we go any further, I have to thank you. You sent us two beautiful books.
Again.
Your latest commentaries on Tess and The Scarlet Letter. And I believe Tess is one of your favorite books ever. Am I right?
You are right. Tess of the D'Urbervilles is one of my top 3 or 4 books of all time. So it was a real joy to present a new volume for readers.
Well, thank you so much for thinking of us. And they are so beautiful. So like John said, let's just push that off to the side and talk about that whole collection at the end of our time together. But first of all, I want to hear about your mom and dad. So you've been close with your mom and dad since you were little. Did you have a time when you weren't and now you are again? What's that relationship been like?
Well, actually, I mean, I love my mom and dad. We've always had a good relationship, but I hadn't lived near them since I was 18 years old and left for college, and they moved to another part of the country. And so for decades, they lived very far away. And then about 11 years ago, when they were trying to figure out where they were going to land for their final years, we decided to bring them here to our place and build them a small home on our property. And so we have been neighbors on the same land. They're right outside my door for the past decade or so, and it's just been a wonderful blessing.
Fabulous. Okay, so in your piece, Living with Your Parents Intentionally Can Be Life-Giving, you talk to any number of couples, families, who are doing essentially the same thing you are doing, Karen, in many ways. Was it surprising for you when you spoke to people about how well this worked? Because it seems from your writing, things tend to work pretty good, which runs counter to the narrative that it would be a train wreck.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just as you guys suggested in your opening, when we think about, adult kids living with their parents, we think of them, living in the basement and never having launched, so to speak. But what happened to inspire this article is that a close friend of mine was moving into a new home that she and her parents had custom built. My friend is single, never married, doesn't have any kids, and they made a similar decision as my parents and I made. And so I sent out a tweet just kind of celebrating my friend for moving into this new home with her parents and making this decision. And I got such a response to that tweet. People were really encouraged by it. And so I just thought I would write an article. And so, of course, I ended up doing more research on this phenomenon, that it's not just, kids who, never left for college or after college, but multi-generational homes were once much more common in America. And, of course, they're common worldwide. And now, I think it's an option that more and more people can and should look at. And some because of the pandemic, but I think even beyond that, we can think about kind of pooling our resources and our lives together in this way.
Yeah, I mean, Karen, here in Pittsburgh, which, mill hunk way back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, it was common. I remember being a boy, in the 60s and 70s and going into my friends' homes. Stada Baba, Grandma and Grandpa lived there. Mom and Dad did as well. Oftentimes, first married couples, there'd be 3, 4, sometimes 5 generations under one roof. That sort of took a little stigma, maybe like in the end of the 70s and the 80s. People's kind of, went their own separate ways. But now it feels as though people, for various reasons, are coming back home again. And that, I think, is a positive thing, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. I mean, just think about, I mean, we've lived a few decades of people just being spread out all over the country, and that removes, grandchildren and grandparents and adult children from parents, and it's very hard. And I mean, there are lots of reasons for that, and sometimes it's inevitable. But I think a lot of people just don't look at it as a deliberate, conscious choice to come back together again and be together.
Sure. Karen Swallow Prior is with us. Karen is the author of On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Literature. Karen, let's talk about what the factors are that are encouraging people to make this choice. What did you find out?
Well, one of the people who responded to my tweet and that I wrote about a little bit in the article is someone who was a widow. And when the pandemic hit, and the lockdown came, she just made the decision with her daughter and son-in-law to move in with them for that time during the lockdown so she could be near them and her young grandchildren. And it worked so well that as the lockdown ended and the pandemic seems to hopefully be over, they just decided as a family that they would maintain that situation because everyone has benefited from it so much. So, it could be something that we do temporarily because of a need that arises, but it doesn't have to be temporary. And I think that's what people are looking at. And there are lots of factors to consider, lots of, questions that should be asked ahead of time and maybe parameters set and so forth. In my situation with my parents, we really didn't have any boundaries or lines we needed to draw. I guess we just sort of have the same kinds of values and boundaries, and it's just worked so well together to be close to one another and to help one another. I mean, I've been hospitalized in the past few years. Both of my parents have, and we've all been able to kind of pull in and tag team in those moments and just help share and carry one another's burdens.
Yeah. I mean, it's a weird dichotomy, and I guess probably especially here in the West, in that there is, oftentimes the so-called loneliness epidemic, right, where people move out of their homes and then there they are in a studio apartment or a one-bedroom apartment with very few friends or resources while family is there, maybe in another city. I wonder, thinking and reading about this, Karen, is there a faith perspective about this that would drive this? I mean, you wrote the piece for Religion News Service. Are Christians somehow more engaged in this than a general population? Did that come up?
I didn't find that in my research, and that really would be a good question to ask. I think that, we are just in a culture that is very individualistic and very work and career driven. So a lot of these decisions get made because people go where the jobs are, and often those jobs are in places that are so expensive that they're small, or they have to, just make a lot of other kinds of sacrifices that keep family members apart. And I think we should question those things. And we should, we can make some decisions that put other priorities first. And maybe that is one of the blessings of the pandemic. A lot of people have seen that some of their, if not all of their jobs can be done remotely. That allows people more choices in where they live. And so this might be one of the blessings that we end this era with is making decisions that are based less on what our actual jobs are and more on how we can do our jobs in balance with other kinds of interests like family.
Dr. Karen Swallow Prior is with us. She's co-editor of Cultural Engagement, a crash course in contemporary issues, which is a really terrific book. She's contributed to numerous other books and has written a whole bunch of her own, which we'll talk about. Karen, I want to switch topic for just a minute and ask you about the cataclysm of last Monday night when you might have been on Twitter like I was and all of a sudden started seeing tweets about this leaked Supreme Court opinion and thought, well, that can't possibly be. And then after a while, you start thinking, wait, I think it is. So I'm asking you about it because you've been involved in the anti-abortion movement for decades. And now in this era of social media and, of course, all the rancor in Washington, this whole story is really jacked up. So give us your feelings on it and your thoughts after we've, known it's been going on for more than a week.
Yeah, well, of course, it's still just a leak. The court has not issued a decision, and even just having such a breach of trust with that leak is certainly a great concern. It kind of feels like an attack on democracy, which is frightening in itself. And so even though I've worked for all of these years in hopes of seeing Roe versus Wade overturned, which, of course, is really just one step in addressing abortion, because it doesn't automatically outlaw it or do anything like that. It just simply overturns a constitutional right to abortion and leaves us all to grapple with it at the state level and then hopefully again, more at a national level if we can become more life affirming. So it's a lot of news to take in, and it's not just the decision itself, but it's kind of where we are as a country. We're so polarized and fractured. I don't know that we can really find unity around this issue. Certainly it's been divisive for a long time, but it's really big news, but it's hard to know what to do with it because it's still not even officially news yet, and these strange times.
Yeah, and when the opinions are released, I mean, someone could have leaked it knowing that the opinion of the court is currently, as we're speaking, different than it was in February. And so it could be another cataclysm when the actual opinion is read. Let's talk, just before you leave us, Karen, just about the conversation online about it. I mean, this has been a poisonous issue since the very beginning. It's not changing now. And so I know that you've been subject to a bunch of really bizarre accusations about you're not pro-life enough, or a pro-life person has to check these appropriate boxes. I mean, it's just so nutty. How are you responding to that? And talk about the boxes that people feel like you have to check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually it takes away from what I wish had been a more celebratory and happy moment, because we're fighting one another, even just within the pro-life movement, and that's a picture of a larger thing that's going on in the church. And so we're going through this time where we really are divided, even among on who our friends are and who our enemies are, and so I really. My approach is to try to find as much common ground as we can and to engage as much dialogue as we can and understand one another as much as we can. But there are people who are really, have different priorities in mind. And so that's another division we face. And it's very painful. But I just want to be faithful and get through it and, inspire others too, because this is a bad time in our nation, and I hope it will pass and we can be part of helping it to pass.
Good for you. Being faithful, that's what we all need to be, not trying to please some sort of, Twitter faction or make the other pro-life people like us or whatever. I mean, just being faithful to what you've been called to do, Karen, which I know you've done for a long time. I appreciate the fact that you put it that way. I heartily second that.
Yeah. Hey, Karen, so there you are. You're a college professor. Your term is over. The school year is over. You've got a little downtime right now. It must seem kind of weird. How do you keep yourself occupied?
Well, it doesn't feel like downtime. I've got a book due at the end of the summer. I've been working on it for the past year, and so hopefully I'll be on, in the next year or so talking about the new book.
Fabulous.
And what's the subject, Karen?
The subject is the social imaginary of the evangelical movement for its past 300 years. It's seen through art, culture, literature, and our everyday lives that we don't necessarily.
Wow, that's an ambitious subject.
That's some heavy lifting.
It's very ambitious. I might have been too ambitious, so send up a prayer for me.
Are the dogs helping in any way, Karen?
They're keeping me entertained,
Okay.
and they like to get in the way too.
Excellent. Okay, just talk about your commentary series on literature, Karen, before you leave us.
Yeah, the series is done with the release of the last two volumes, Tess of the D'Urbervilles and The Scarlet Letter. We also have Frankenstein, Sense and Sensibility, Heart of Darkness, and Jane Eyre. And these are all beautiful hard-cloth volumes that have introductions by me and light annotations for hard words or archaic terms, and lots of discussion questions. So you can pick up one of these books and treat it like taking a class with me by yourself or with a book club.
Listen, this would make such a beautiful gift for anyone who loves those books.
So well done.
These are it's a lovely binding. It's a beautiful typeface. Everything about it, just first class. And of course, the content you can't beat. Karen, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Always good to have
Take
you.
care.
Always good. Karen Swallow Pryor, you can find her easily online. She is a writer extraordinaire
And follow her on
in many
Twitter.
different places. Yeah, Twitter's an excellent place where she posts regularly. Karen Swallow Pryor, research professor of English and Christianity Culture, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary.
The goal of this commercial is to show you that if you buy a new home this year without using our 2 advantages, you will probably have made a pretty big boo-boo financially. I learned that word from my nieces. It's Ryan from United Faith Mortgage, and today we announced something brand new. For Word FM listeners,